Today, my guest is Gleb Tsipursky. He is the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, and he's on a mission to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases, which devastate bottom lines and bring down high-flying careers. He's authored hundreds of articles and written multiple best-selling books, including Never Go With Your Gut, The Truth Seekers Handbook, and his newest book, Blind Spots Between Us. He received his PhD in History of Behavioral Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And in just a minute, we're going to speak with Gleb about decision-making for your business. But first, a quick reminder, if you like the show, CREPN Radio, please let us know. You can like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you'd like to leave a comment, we would love to hear from our listeners. And if you would also like to see how handsome our guests are, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, and you can find that at Commercial Real Estate Pro Network on the YouTube. With that, I want to welcome my guest, Gleb. Welcome to CREPN Radio.
Thank you, Darren. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm delighted that you were able to join us today, and I'm looking forward to our talk this afternoon. Before we get started, if you could take just a minute and share with the listeners a little more about your background.
Sure. So I've always been fascinated with decision making ever since I was a kid, because the typical way that we are taught to do decision making, the way you've probably heard a lot, is to go with our gut, follow our intuition. That's the most typical advice about decision making. Everyone hears that. Well, my parents were very much gut-oriented decision makers. So they felt something was right, their intuition told them it was right, and they did it. Unfortunately, often their intuition opposed each other's intuition. So for example, my mom liked to buy nice clothing, and my dad was kind of a cheapskate. So she'd go out and she'd buy a $50 sweater, and she'd come home and he'd yell at her, say that, oh, sweater shouldn't cost anything more than $20 and stuff like that. And then they'd be off and fighting and so on. And already as a kid, I thought that was kind of dumb. It wasn't really helpful. The question wasn't resolved, and they still kept fighting and fighting and fighting. It wasn't good for their relationship. And it impacted me as a kid, obviously, to hear my mom and dad yell at each other. But the worst time was this one time when my dad was a real estate agent, and he had a variable salary based on commissions. And there was a period of about 6 months where he made a lot of money, but he hid it from my mom, said he made very little money, probably didn't want her to spend on sweaters. And so he bought an apartment elsewhere and leased it out to some folks. In about a couple of years, my mom found out about it, and she was so mad. She was so pissed. There was a huge, big blowout fight. They actually ended up separating for a while. And so I lived with my mom and didn't see my dad much in that period. They eventually reconciled, but you could never really trust him again. So I saw that my parents make terrible decisions about financial matters. And so that really impelled me to try to figure out, why do we make such bad decisions? Why does nobody sit us down? Why did nobody sit me down and tell me, hey, kiddo, here's how you make decisions? And my parents didn't do that. I wasn't taught how to make good decisions in school, or even in college. Once I got to college, nobody taught me to make good decisions. They taught me math, they taught me geography, but not decision making, even though decision making is so fundamentally important to everything we do in our lives, from business to personal lives to relationships. Let's not even talk about relationships. There's a reason there's a 40% divorce rate in this country. So I decided to study decision making, how we make decisions badly and how we can screw up our decisions, and how we can fix the screwed up decision making that we tend to make. So I studied this topic, and as I started studying this topic, people became interested in what I had to say. So I became a trainer, consultant, and coach, which I've been doing for about 20 years and working in this field. At the same time, once I exhausted the very slim pickings there were on how to make good decisions in popular media, I decided I need to actually study this formally. So I went into academia, and that's where I got my PhD in the history of behavioral science, looking at the cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics of decision making. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and a behavioral economist. I spent about 15 years in academia, including 7 years at Ohio State as a professor, teaching about this stuff and researching it. And so that's where the book Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters came about. Combination of my consulting and coaching experience plus the actual cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics of decision making. So that's what my background is like. And of course, all my other books also touch on various things. The Blind Spots Between Us talks about professional and personal relationships, and the Truth Seekers Handbook talks about decision making in personal life.
Got it. Well, that's a fascinating life story from a standpoint of something that affected you in your childhood. How it made such a big impression and kind of drove your career there. That's it's really cool because I think so many times people, especially if there's any kind of pain involved, you hear about more people trying to avoid something and I guess in a way maybe that's what you're trying to do is avoid the pain of your childhood by understanding it better. Is that
Not so much the pain of my childhood, but I really care about people. I've always been someone who has a value set of utilitarianism, meaning wanting the most good for the most number. It always hurt me to see people suffer. So the fact that so many people suffer, I mean, I suffered as a kid, and I learned good decision making by myself, but I didn't have to teach about it to others. The reason I got interested in teaching about it to others, in popularizing it and helping leaders make better decisions was that this professionals and so on make better decisions is because I see all the suffering that comes from it. I mean, think about, let's say, the fiscal. I grew up during the dot-com boom and bust, when in 1999 I was 18, when all the tech leaders were partying like it's 1999. And then just a couple of years later, there was the dot-com bust, when the people who were the heroes in the Wall Street Journal suddenly became zeros. And so many people lost their life savings. So many people, it was a tragedy. I mean, I knew people who really suffered in that period. And so just seeing that was terrible for me to just to go through that. And even worse were the bad, malicious decisions taken by the leaders of Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco to hide their losses of these companies using fraudulent accounting methods. And so seeing the kind of bad decision making, terrible decision making by these leaders really made me realize how important business leaders are to the lives of everyone around them. So that made me really passionate and fascinated with how I can make a difference by popularizing good decision making for everyone and especially for business leaders.
well? It's interesting, when you think about some of the examples you cited there. Um, I'm kind of curious. Do you have any kind of an insight or um, have you come up with a reason for any of those that you cited, like the Enron and these others, that the reasons for the bad decisions?
Yes, so with Enron, the main bad decision making came from actually what drives us to make decisions. So we talk about our gut, we talk about our intuition, but what is that? Well, it's about our emotions, our feelings. And what the research on decision making shows is that our feelings, our emotions, our intuitions drive about 80 to 90% of our decisions when we just go ahead and let them drive our decisions. Now, unfortunately, our feelings, our intuitions, they're not adapted for the modern environment. They're adapted for the savanna environment. When we were living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, when we were hunters, foragers, and gatherers. And there are lots of things about the savanna environment, the tribal environment, that are not a good fit for the modern environment, but we still have the instincts of going forward and making the decisions as though we're in the tribal savannah. So, for example, for survival and thriving in the tribe, it was very important for us to climb the tribal hierarchy. We are the descendants of those who climbed the tribal hierarchy and then thrived and survived and spread their genes, because the people at the top of the tribal hierarchy were the ones most capable of spreading their genes. There is a reason about 5% of us on the earth are descended from the great conqueror Genghis Khan, according to recent research. So there's a reason for that. So we are very strongly pushed to try to climb the social hierarchy, to stay at the top of the tribal hierarchy. And the leaders of Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco, the Bernie Ebbers of the world, and so on, what we now know about them is that what drove them to make their terrible decisions to hide their losses was fear of failure, fear of being seen as losing social status among their peers. Now, the decision to use fraudulent accounting didn't really delay the reckoning by more than a year or two. And what, did they got a year more of bonuses for in exchange for what, 10, 15 years of prison? And how much money did they lose while they were in prison compared to what they could have gained? It was terrible decision making on their part because look at how much they lost. It's not like they won. They actually really seriously lost for using fraudulent accounting methods. But what happened was that they were letting their intuitions lead, letting their gut reactions lead, and their gut reactions told them that we can't afford to lose. We can't afford to lose our social status in the eyes of the tribe, in the eyes of our peers, and therefore we'll make these bad decisions which will prevent us from losing social status. So the fear of failure that drove them is actually, when I do consulting and coaching for business leaders, I see it very often. I see the fear of failure, the fear of loss, and especially the fear of losing social status. The top level, when you have plenty of money, what really drives people a lot is not wanting to be seen as a failure, wanting to be seen as a success, and they often make really bad decisions because of that.
So, how can you guard against making decisions based on the fear of failure?
What you want to do is distance yourself from this social status seeking. Recognize that, hey, social status seeking is just an inherent part of what we do as human beings. It's very natural, it's very intuitive. In the same way that it's very intuitive for us when we come across a source of sugar, to eat as much of it as possible. Because in the savanna environment, think about what happened. If you came across some grapes or some bananas or some apples, it was very important for you to eat as much of it as possible in order to survive and thrive. We're the descendants of those who were able to do that because the other people didn't. The other people who are not ancestors because they died. So we're the descendants of those who were able to do it. Now, when we come across a box of Krispy Kreme dozen donuts, we want to eat the whole dozen donuts. That's the intuitive thing. That's a natural thing for us to do. That because we're driven to have all that sugar. Now, you hopefully have learned over time and developed the mental habit that it's important to not eat the dozen donuts. You want maybe one donut, two donuts, but you got to stop at the third donut. Don't eat more than two donuts. Not everyone learned that, which is why we have the obesity epidemic in this country. But still, hopefully you understand that that's a bad idea, even though you might end up doing it sometimes when you have low willpower. Not that I ever did it. So you want to you want to understand that this is a bad mental tendency that comes from our gut reactions, and you have learned to restrain yourself from eating all the sugar that you can. In the same way, you need to learn to recognize what are all the dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases that our brain pushes us to make, that our gut reactions, our intuitions, when we just tell people to go with their gut, pushes us to make because of how our brain is wired. You need to learn about all of them, and you need to restrain yourself from falling into them. And there are specific techniques for doing so. And the social status seeking is just one of those. You need to learn to recognize when you are falling into that social status seeking mode, when you're afraid of losing status in the eyes of those around you, and when that's driving you to make some terrible decisions that will hurt you and others going forward.
So, it's funny you bring up the social status seeking mode, which makes me think of all of the social media kind of stuff where, most of it's like a highlight reel about everybody winning.
Yes.
And I know there's been numerous studies done about just the dopamine that, when you see the reactions to your post or whatever, that gives you a certain pleasure.
Yes.
So if that is, and I don't want to say that's that's the tell, but if from a decision maker standpoint, that you mentioned you want to try and discipline yourself for not seeking that or be wary of that fear of failure or that need for social status. So, but if you're somebody that's looking at potentially investing with somebody, are there ways that you can identify somebody that potentially may have this kind of a fear of failure, that you should be wary of? I mean, if you were working with or investing in Enron at the time, was there anything that you could have identified or things that you could have done to prevent or so you could have gotten out ahead of the crash?
So what we know, we have some research. So I'm going to speak from what the research shows. We know that leaders, CEOs, whether leaders of financial firms or other sorts of firms, when you see them appearing often in the media, that is a strong sign that they are overconfident and that they are displaying social status in a way that's going beyond where they should be. So we know that, for example, we know that leaders who appear, the more often a CEO appears in the media, the more they tend to overpay for a company that they buy. So if you're thinking about, okay, merger and acquisition, if the leader of a company that's about to do a merger and acquisition appears often in the media, this is likely to be one of those many, many M&As that fail. M&As fail at a rate of very high rate. They fail at a rate of about 80%. So about 80% of all mergers and acquisitions fail to create value. They destroy value. And the more a leader tends to appear in the media, the more of a failure it will be, the less likely it will be to be a success, and the more of a negative impact it will have. And there's many others. So leaders who tend to appear more often in the media, who have, if you look at the sentiment analysis, the kind of language that they use, which you as a potential investor can certainly look at the language and see if the language is fluffy, if the language is excessive, if the language is hypey, if it's hyping it up, then you're likely to see that later the company will be worth less than it should have been worth compared to other companies where the leaders don't use this sort of hyped up language. So there is definitely tells that we know, very clear tells based on the research in cognitive neuroscience that you can use to predict which companies are going to have leaders who make bad decisions because of their excessive overconfidence, excessive overhyping. So these are things that you want to really be careful about and watch out for. Now, leaders who tend to be in the background, those leaders don't get nearly as much credit as they actually should. So if you look at the kind of leaders who have the company result in the highest profits, it's very often leaders who are less grandiloquent, who speak less, and who actually do more. And those are the leaders. The funny thing is, those are not the companies that get the initial investment. They're not kind of the Elon Musk, Tesla going through the roof, but they are the companies that get the most profit. So they get the most revenue per share. And those are the companies, the value bets that you want to be confident will actually earn you the most money. So those are just some of the many things that I talk about in my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, if you want to make smart financial decisions.
Yeah, and I appreciate you kind of going through that. The majority of the audience is either a real estate investor or looking to invest in real estate, and a lot of the deals that they're constantly making decisions, whether it be on a market or a property, underwriting a property, maybe be the team that they select, property manager, on and on it goes. And it's funny because you mentioned this, and I think that there's a natural wariness sometimes of what's presented, or just the need to, you have to do your homework, whether it be if you're dealing direct with the seller, or if you're looking to invest in a syndication or whatever. You've got to kind of lift the hood and question the information and make sure you get an answer on that. Based on that, I'm just kind of curious if is there a strategy that you would recommend or suggest that people like real estate investors consider when investing?
Yeah, so the book talks about strategies that are relevant, very relevant for investors and for anyone else looking to make a good business decision. Of course, people who are making a decision in business about which vendor to select and which clients to work with, and the client decides, making a decision on whether to buy something, you have to make the same sort of decision as an investor. And I describe two methods in the book which are fundamentally valuable in addressing a lot of cognitive biases at once. One for casual decisions, meaning casual decisions which you don't want to screw up, but you don't want to maximize, where you want to get a satisfactory, good enough decision. And this is a method that takes only a couple of minutes. And it is something that you want to make sure you use multiple times throughout the day for any sort of moderately important decision that you don't want to screw up. There's also and this involves 5 questions. There's also a longer 8-step method that you want to use for more major, serious decisions when you're actually deciding on whether to take that big deal or not, whether you're deciding to enter into a partnership or not, something that really makes a major impact on your bottom line and where you want to get the perfect answer or as perfect as possible rather than a good enough answer. So, but for the good enough answer, let's talk about the 5 questions you want to ask about anything that you don't want to screw up. Let's say you're thinking about, I don't know, writing an email to a potential business partner and you want to work out a nuanced issue as part of the email. So that's an email, it's a serious email, you don't want to screw it up, but it's not going to make or break your bottom line. First question you want to ask of 5 questions. What important information didn't I yet fully consider? So what evidence didn't you take into account? Let's say you want to influence your business partner to take a certain decision. Now, have you considered all the reasons why they may not take that decision? That's often evidence that we don't take into account. So we just write the email hoping they'll ignore all the evidence, all the information that you would not want them to consider. However, the email would likely be much stronger if you think about their perspective and if you take it into account and address in advance all of their concerns. So that's information that you haven't considered. Now, if you do consider it, you can revise your email to take those issues into account and be much better able to influence your business partner to make the decision that you want them to make. So that's the first question. That's an example of how you apply it. Second, what dangerous judgment errors haven't I addressed in this situation? So what cognitive biases might be playing a role that you haven't considered? There are very many cognitive biases. My book talks about the 30 most dangerous ones for investing, for deal making, for business leadership, for all sorts of things. So you want to take a look at the 30 most dangerous ones, take a look at my book, Never Go With Your Gut. And if you want to look at the ones for relationships in particular, look at the blind spots between us. But for business decision making, never go with your gut. Next one, what would a trusted and objective advisor tell me to do? So think about someone who's that trusted and objective advisor to you. What would they tell you to do? What would Darren tell you to do? What would that little angel on your shoulder tell you to do? We got about 50% of this benefit by just asking the question, taking ourselves outside of ourselves. So what would you tell a friend to do about this email in an objective situation? And you get the other 50% of the benefit by actually asking a trusted and objective advisor. So call this person, or if you're a millennial, text this person. Next, how have I addressed all the ways this decision could fail? So think about the email. Let's say your business partner happens to be in a bad mood when they read the email and they misinterpret it and they get upset, and then whatever you want to see happen doesn't happen. How can you address that in advance? Well, perhaps read the email as though your business partner receives it when they're in a bad mood, and then address all the ambiguities and uncertainties and lack of clarity in the email. And that will help you address all the problems that would happen if the business partner is in a bad mood. Finally, what would cause you to change your mind about this decision? So what would cause you to reevaluate your choice? For example, with the email, you could say, hey, if I don't get an answer from my business partner within a week, I will give this person a call. And now, once you make this decision, you can just send the email and you can let it go, knowing you have a revision point in a week. Whereas otherwise, you'd be kind of thinking about it, it would be weighing on your mind, why is your business partner not responding? Should you send another email? Should you call? Whereas right now, if you make a decision in advance that if you don't hear from that person in 7 days, in a week, you will give a call, you just let it go and just go forward. So those 5 questions are very effective for addressing a whole range of bad decisions that we tend to make on an everyday level, minimizing risks. And this, again, is for minimizing risks, not for maximizing rewards, for minimizing risks for anything that you don't want to screw up.
So I got a question. If you apply that 5-step process, how many emails do you write up that you like not to send?
Yes, that will definitely happen. You'll realize that maybe that's not the best email for you to send. So yes,
Yeah,
that is a good point.
well, I was going to say, because I know I haven't necessarily thought of them in those the 1 through 5 there, but I can tell you numerous times throughout the day, I'll start an email or a text or something, and then I'll realize, what's the point of this kind of thing? It's not gonna, is there going to be any benefit from this?
Yeah.
No, I appreciate you taking us through that, and especially I think just the, ask, at least personally, as I was listening to that, what would a trusted advisor tell me to do?
Hmm.
Because I think that right there is making me think outside of just the one-to-one. If there's
Yes.
any kind of emotion involved in the the reaction, if it's a reaction, especially, I think there's power in waiting, as
Hmm.
opposed to reacting like that. So I appreciate you taking us through that. I got a question for you. You referred to a couple of times through the information about how this is like a historical way we've been wired. I want to say,
Hmm.
I don't want to put
Yeah,
words in
our
your mouth.
brains are wired.
Yeah, but is that do you find that that's at a cellular level, or is that more of like your grandparents did it that way, your parents saw it, and it's just kind of a transfer of behavior based on the experience?
It
uh
is at a cellular, it is at the cellular level, meaning biological, meaning genetic in this case. So if you look at babies, you can see that these traits already exhibited in babies. You can see that babies do things like loss aversion. They exhibit things like tribalism. So I talked a little bit about tribalism. So tribalism, one of them is status seeking. One aspect of tribalism is status seeking. Another aspect of tribalism is that it was very important for us in the savannah environment to be very strongly attracted to people who are like us, meaning like and trust people who seem to be like us, who have our values, who seem to like the things that we like the same flavor of ice cream, right? And to not like people who don't seem like us, who seem different from us. So that was very important in that environment, because if we're going to be kicked out of our small little tribe, we would die. And if our tribe fell apart because we weren't supportive enough of our tribe, we would also die. So we're the descendants of those people who didn't die because they were very tribal. And they opposed attacking tribal members, hostile tribes, which wanted to claim their territory. So that's why I don't like other people who aren't like you. So you can see already those sorts of things, those examples already in babies, where babies, if you show a baby someone who likes the same thing that they do, and the baby will like that person more, will be more attracted to that person. So these are not things that the babies haven't learned about these things yet. They are ingrained in us from when we're actually pretty, they're genetic instincts. So they're instinctive. And that is why they're very dangerous, because they're instinctive. They're not something we learned from our parents. They're just part of who we are. They're part of our genes, and they're ingrained behaviors. And that's the danger of following these ingrained behaviors, that they're not a good fit for the modern world.
No, that's good. Um, Hey, I want to ask you a little bit about and you mentioned it, this fear of loss,
Yes.
or loss aversion. Um, can you speak to that and just uh,
Mhm.
kind of expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. So here's the interesting study that was done by a large bank I won't name. It looked at its best investors, people who had its accounts who were the best people which grew the highest, and found that there were two categories of investors that were the best investors. One, people who forgot about their accounts, and two, people who died.
Oh, really?
Yes.
You got a chance there. If you die, you could be one of the best investors, right?
There you go, exactly. So, because there are so many people who, on average, investors tend to buy high and sell low. And that comes from various dangerous judgment errors. One of the biggest cognitive biases that causes this is called loss aversion. So, loss aversion is our tendency to want to avoid losses even at the expense of getting much higher gains. So it's a really fascinating phenomenon. If you There's been studies done showing that asking someone, "Hey, here's a coin flip experiment. I'll give you $40 right now, and in exchange, not in exchange. So you have the $40 now. Will you give me that $40 for a flip of a coin where if you get heads, you get $100, where if it's tails, you get zero. Now, if you get that experiment to people, you'll see that about 80 to 90% of the people choose to keep the $40. They don't want to do the coin flip. But the coin flip, the equivalent value of the coin flip is $50. It's 50% of 100. So think about what happens with a coin flip if you do a coin flip 100 times, if you do it 1,000 times, if you do it 100,000 times. 100,000 times, that's a difference of 40 million of 4 million versus 5 million. That's the difference between the $40 equivalent and the $50 equivalent. But we are very much so. If I say that to when I say that to people, they say, "Well, you didn't tell me about the repeating scenario. You told me just this one-time scenario." If I thought about it differently, if you told me it was a repeating scenario, well, our gut reaction tends to see anything that we do as a one-time thing. It doesn't see the broader context of decisions that we tend to make. It doesn't go toward that high gain, the 50% chance of $50, the 50% chance of $100 instead of the $40 I can keep right now. So this is one of the biggest problems that we tend to go for. We tend to want the bird in the hand instead of the two in the bush, even when we have a pretty strongly guaranteed chance of getting the two in the bush. And because in the savanna environment, think about it, in the savanna environment, we were in a very precarious environment where we didn't have banks. It didn't make sense for us to gather resources. It's not like if you kill the mammoth, you can put all the food in the fridge, right? You can't store up your resources. So in the savanna environment, it made a lot of sense for us to go for the immediate short-term gains and to ignore the larger potential gains from investing these resources and to avoid losses, because in the precarious savanna environment, if we risked our resources, the $40 for the pretty sizable chance of winning $100, then maybe there would be a drought or something like that and we would die. So in that sort of precarious environment, it made sense to go to avoid losses, to make sure to preserve as many short-term resources as possible. In the modern environment, it really doesn't. We have banks, we're pretty well protected from immediate short-term losses. And so if you make a short-term loss of $40, not a big deal. You will still win out overall over 1 million coin flips, and get the $50 million equivalent. However, that's not what our gut tells us. So we tend to, when we are faced with this short-term loss, when we see stocks falling, we tend to immediately want to sell them, even though it might not be the right time to sell. And when we see stocks as going high, we experience FOMO, fear of missing out, and we tend to want to buy them, even though it may not be the best time to buy, even though they might have peaked. So these are times when we are falling into that loss aversion. We want to avoid the loss of not getting into a good thing, and we want to avoid the loss of more pain from stocks going down, and we make bad decisions. And of course, this applies to not only stocks. This applies to commercial real estate deals. This applies to all sorts of deals. This applies to our general way of thinking and being in the world. So you need to be very careful and know that, hey, this is a tendency in which we human beings fall into, and you need to be constantly aware of this and scanning your environment for this tendency, just like you're scanning your environment and making sure to not eat a dozen donuts, because it's very easy for us to eat a dozen donuts if we're not paying attention to it. And it's very easy for us to just come home and plop down on the couch and watch Netflix instead of going out to the gym, which ideally you want to do about 30 minutes of exercise a day. But in the savanna environment, you want to preserve all the resources, all the calories that you could, and not do exercises. So we are wired to sit at home and watch Netflix all day, the equivalent of sitting in the camp and by the campfire and doing that all day. So this is a problem for us, and you want to make sure to be watching out for all of these sorts of problems, cognitive biases, loss aversion, and all of these status seeking and so on. And so that's loss aversion is one of the biggest ones that investors tend to fall into, that causes them a lot of pain, like this big bank discovered.
No, it's interesting, when you think about it, based on the two best investors, those that forgot about the account or those that died. It sounds like sometimes not making a decision is one of the best decisions that you can make.
And that's why I was giving the example of when stocks are going up, that may not be the best time to buy these stocks. And when stocks are going down, that may not be the best time to sell these stocks. And that's just one of many reasons why people who do that are often the ones who lose.
Well, and I think it also, especially in real estate, I know I've bought at the high and at the low,
Mm,
and but over time, if you have enough time, it all works out. It's a matter of you. I think if maybe the first decision would be, can I afford to lose this money, or can I afford to not worry about it, or how much time do I have,
yes.
kind of thing. Because if you start from that standpoint and understand you may need a longer horizon to get to your goal, but you will make your goal, maybe just not on such a short horizon. And I think right now, especially where we're at with the cycle of the market,
Mm,
um, when people look at it and realize just how low the market was, uh, in the crash,
yes.
and how far up it's come,
Hmm.
there's this natural tendency to think, and I think it kind of plays on what we've been talking about here, is this kind of the fear of the next crash. Um, and then in the news recently, the coronavirus and other things that suggest, uh, there's like the antenna are up looking for the next shoe to drop, as opposed to, like you were saying, the long run is things, you flip the coin enough times, or if you buy and stay in enough deals,
Hmm.
uh, it sounds like to me that you're probably going to be all right. It's more a matter of that if you're trying to time it, kind of thing, that you might not win. So
Yes, so you want to make sure that's why value investing is a pretty good bet. You want to make sure if the deal makes sense over time rather than trying to time the market. And trying to time the market, whether it's the real estate market or the stock market, is usually not going to win out, especially because you're competing against others who are trying to time the market. And when you're competing against the big firms that are trying to time the market, they're often going to be better at timing the market than you are. And so you can actually get the best chance for smaller investors, according to research on this topic, is to try to do value investing, whether in the real estate or elsewhere. So focusing on the fundamentals rather than trying to time the market.
got it. Hey, Gleb, if we could, I'd like to shift gears here for a second. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, by day I'm an insurance broker, and as such, we try and work with our clients to manage risk. And there's a couple of different strategies we consider when trying to manage risk. The first is we ask, can we avoid the risk?
Mm-hmm.
If that's not an option, we look and ask, can we minimize the risk? And if that's not an option, then we look and ask, can we transfer the risk? And that's what an insurance policy is a risk transfer tool.
Mm-hmm.
And as such, I've been asking my guests if they can identify what they consider to be the biggest risk. And just for clarity, I'm not necessarily looking for an insurance related answer. I think some people, they think because I'm in insurance that that's what I'm looking for, but it's not, because I realize that risk is, far reaching. In fact, everything we've been talking about here is kind of managing risk from a standpoint of
Yes.
decision making. But if you're willing, I'd like to ask you, Gleb Tsipursky, what is the biggest risk?
So, what is the biggest risk for me? You're asking.
Yeah, you or however you
Mm-hmm.
you can identify it, you personally, or if you see investors, or how you see
Mm-hmm.
people making decisions, or however you want to frame the question
So
and frame the answer.
for me and for many other people who are like me, the biggest risk I would say is a cognitive bias called the optimism bias. So I tend to be very optimistically biased. What does that mean? It's one of the cognitive biases where people tend to see the future as always bright, as always great, as the grass is green on the other side of the hill, everything is going to be wonderful, tend to be risk blind and tend to be have exaggerated expectations. So I tend to systematically underestimate risks for my future, for myself. And this is a huge problem. I've run into many, many mistakes and many problems that I wouldn't have to run into if I was not intuitively risk blind, if I was not just focusing on the opportunities instead of the threats. So I've had to really work on myself and train myself, and had to get some outside advisors and help who are pessimistically oriented to run my ideas by, because I just don't see the inherent flaws in them, which there are many. I'm the kind of person who has 20 ideas before breakfast and thinks they're all brilliant. Now, to my bitter experience, I've learned they're not. But this is something I know I have to deal with. And this is something that I've learned to mitigate by both calibrating myself better, knowing that I tend to be way too optimistic, and getting outside help from people who are pessimistic, who I trust, who I can run ideas by, and who can tell me that, hey, these are 20 half-baked potatoes, and 17 of them don't make sense, but maybe these three you could work on and finish baking them into fully baked potatoes.
No, that's great. I love kind of employing even what you were talking about with just the 5 questions there, is kind of bouncing your idea off of somebody else there. That's a lot of power in that. So, all right. So, Gleb, before we wrap up, where can the listeners go if they would like to learn more or connect with you?
Well, my books are available in bookstores everywhere. They're published by great traditional publishers. Never Go There Got is published by Career Press. The Blind Spots Between Us is published by New Harbinger. The Truth Seekers Handbook is published by Intentional Insights. So they're available in physical bookstores everywhere. You can check them out in Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores, university bookstores, and whatnot. And of course online on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and elsewhere. My information is going to be on disasteravoidanceexperts.com. And again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com. There's going to be blogs, podcasts, videocasts, guides, decision aids, manuals, services, and consulting, coaching, and speaking and training, and so on. You want to especially make sure to go to disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. There's a free 8-video-based course on making good decisions that includes, as the first step of the course, an assessment on the 30 most dangerous judgment errors in professional decision making, whether business, investing, and so on. Again, that's disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And I'm very active on LinkedIn, so if you have any questions about anything you've heard, connect with me there and ask me any questions. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, GLEB TSIPURSKY.
Got it. And for our listeners, I'll have that listed in the show notes. So if you're driving and not able to write, you can find that there. Gleb, I want to say thanks again for taking the time to talk. I've enjoyed it and learned a lot, and I hope we can do it again soon.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right. For our listeners, if you like this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Remember, the more you know, the more you grow. That's all we've got this week. Until next time, thanks for listening to Commercial Real Estate Pro Network's CREPN Radio.